Hello and welcome back to Bitcoin Math. My name is Shane, and today we're going to go over living a Bitcoin standard, getting started. So if you haven't seen our living a Bitcoin standard calculator or the model that we did, check out the comments and see the link because that'll set the base for you so that you kind of have an understanding of what we're talking about here, what the long-term implications are if you were to convert, say, all of your income every week, every 2 weeks, every month, whatever it is, however often you get paid, and convert all that into Bitcoin. Because the thesis there is really just looking at the mathematics of, say, borrowing your monthly expenses at 10% while you are investing all of your income into Bitcoin at, say, 30% compound annual growth for the next 20 years. The difference, that 20%, is really going to be your net gain every single year. And as that compounds, well, the overall performance of your assets or your wealth or whatever, however you're measuring that, should start to break away, just like this purple line starts to dramatically break away from the other two lines, which are your nominal and your real income after inflation. So check out that video. That'll set the stage for this model that we're going to cover today, which is based on feedback, questions, requests that I've gotten from a lot of you and from others, like, hey, I love that model. I love this whole thing. How do I do it? How do I get started? What are the best practices? What do I need to know? And this is not financial advice. I'm not saying that this is the best way to do this or the only way or that you should do this. I'm just giving people tools so they can educate themselves about what these things look like for their particular scenario. From that point forward, you have to make your own decisions, consult with the professionals, and all the fun things. So before we get started, a couple of concepts that we need to double click on. Number one is loan to value. What is loan to value? Well, it is basically the ratio of your loan, in this case, let's say $50,000, to the value of the collateral that you provided to get said loan. For the example, let's say you provided $100,000 in Bitcoin assets and you borrowed $50,000. That would mean your loan, $50,000, to value $100,000 is 0.5 or 50% LTV. Now, 50% LTV is about the common metric or benchmark or really maximum that a lot of lenders will lend up to. But depending on which approach you take, whether you go CFI or whether you go DeFi, those numbers will change. If you don't know what CFI or DeFi means or what that looks like, check out our strategy guide. Borrowing against Bitcoin is one of the things that we've outlined here. In CFI, it's going to be working with regulated entities, lenders like Salt Lending, which is who we partner with. That's actually where I work. But there's others out there too: Arch Lending, Strike, Ledin, Unchained, and a handful of others. And what happens there is you are going through a more traditional TradFi type of process. You go through KYC, they do AML. There's underwriting, things of that nature. You deposit your collateral and then they will lend you dollars against that collateral, typically for 12 months, in some cases up to 24 months or perhaps more. In the case of DeFi, well, it's different because you're not doing KYC. There are no loan terms or durations, and really everything is automated through the smart contract platform. So in the case of Aave, right, you're basically depositing your qualifying asset collateral. In this case, it'll be wrapped Bitcoin or Coinbase Bitcoin are the examples that I like to use. And then you can borrow up to, I believe it's 73% loan to value against your assets. And that's all going to work and flow and function differently. There's more tools required there. It's a little bit more nuanced and there's more steps involved, and you have to wrap your Bitcoin, which a lot of people don't want to do. So you really have to decide which flavor of this works best for you. There are trade-offs and pros and cons to both, and I encourage you to fully explore those to learn more. So once you've got that, though, there's a couple of elements to double click on. One of them is loan to value because, well, a lot of lenders or perhaps DeFi protocols restrict how high you can go with LTV. Um, in the case of Aave, right, max LTV is going to be 73%. And the reason why this is important is because, well, they're going to liquidate you at 78% loan to value. And that's another key concept for us to double click on, because when we talk about risk and when we go through the different risk scoring based on LTV here in this model, well, it's all going to be based on the liquidation risk, meaning the risk of getting liquidated. And so in DeFi, your liquidation threshold is going to be 78%. And if that happens, they're going to sell up to half of your collateral to pay down some of the outstanding loan balance in order to bring your LTV down. Okay. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, and I guess really the biggest reason, is because of the liquidation penalty or the fee that you pay if and or when you get liquidated. Now, there's a lot of FUD out there around liquidations because people always talk about getting wiped out by liquidation and all these things. But here's the deal. The only reason people get wiped out when it comes to liquidations is because they are taking on leverage, multiples of leverage against their original starting asset value. So for purposes of what we're going to be looking at, we're never going to be higher than 2x leverage, meaning we're never going to have more than $100,000 in loans against a total of $200,000 in assets. Okay? Because if that were to happen, well, if the protocol sold even all of my loan or half of my collateral to pay off all of my loan, well, I would ultimately be paying a 5% fee, which comes out to roughly $5,000 or 5%. Okay. Now, the reason why people get wiped out when it comes to liquidations is because they take on massive amounts of leverage, right? So look in the case of 10x leverage. Your original $100,000, you've now levered up to $1 million, and you've taken each of the additional $900,000 that you've borrowed, and you've looped that into more Bitcoin and levered it way up. Well, what happens if you get liquidated in that scenario? If they have to sell enough collateral to pay off $900,000 in your outstanding loan, well, what's that going to cost you at 5%? Well, it's going to cost you $45,000. Well, you only started with $100,000 in assets. So if you have to pay a $45,000 fee, well, you just lost 45% of your starting collateral value. And this is why racking up leverage and taking out significant multiples of leverage is risky, because if you get liquidated, well, you paid the price. Case in point, at 20x leverage, you've taken your $100,000, you've levered it up to $2 million. If you get liquidated and have to pay a 5% penalty, well, you're basically losing all of your starting money, right? So the fee is so big because of the 20x leverage that you are ultimately wiping yourself out. So when people talk about getting wiped out due to leverage, this is why. But if you're keeping things at a low risk level, you're using smart leverage, and you're keeping the leverage risk low, well, then paying a 5% fee for them to sell some of your collateral to pay off some of your loan balance is not going to be the end of the world. But again, do your own research, check this concept out further, and make sure you understand it. The other thing that we'll look at here is how big some of these Bitcoin price drops have to be in order to trigger a liquidation threshold. So in the case of Aave, if we're looking at their liquidation threshold, it's 78% loan to value, okay? Well, if you started your loan at 30% loan to value, right? I give Aave $100,000 worth of Bitcoin. I borrow $30,000. I have a 30% loan to value ratio. Well, if the Bitcoin price were to fall 61.5%, right, pretty significant, well, that would trigger this 78% liquidation threshold and I would get liquidated. Okay? But from a risk management standpoint, can you manage a price drop of 61.5%? Do you have enough time to respond? Can you add more collateral? Can you pay down some of your loan? Can you do whatever maneuvering is required throughout the course of a 61.5% price drop? I hope. But you can see how this changes, right? As your LTV goes up, you get closer to that liquidation threshold, which means you're now able to tolerate a smaller price drop from the collateral asset, in this case, Bitcoin. Okay. Now, if you're using a CeFi lender like Salt Lending, they have a 90.91% LTV trigger for stabilization. Their stabilization is different than liquidation. They don't actually pay down the loan. They just convert your collateral into USDC, and then you have some optionality from there. But if we come back to this, with a 90.91% stabilization trigger starting at 30% LTV, that's an even bigger buffer that I now have. Same with 50% LTV. I can tolerate a 45% drop in the price of Bitcoin. So these are some things that you should study and learn more about if you want to get into managing, living a Bitcoin standard and managing these loans and LTVs and risk and liquidation thresholds on your own. These are some things I would encourage you to double click on yourself. Okay. Now, the other important element here is going to be the Bitcoin expense buffer. Okay, I might update this because the language and the jargon and everything is a little bit confusing. I did create an FAQ. You can come down here, getting started, bada bing. The Bitcoin buffer is basically what is your initial expense cushion in months times your monthly living costs. Okay, so if your living costs are $5,000 and you have $50,000 in Bitcoin, well, then you have a 10-month, 50,000 divided by 5, you have a 10-month buffer, right? That means that you can bring $50,000 in Bitcoin to this scenario to get started, and that gives you essentially 10 months of runway to act as a collateral buffer to allow you to grow into this. Okay, so we'll put a pin in that for now. What you're going to see here is that we're going to try to stay in the green zone. When we get into the yellow, orange, or red, right? Yellow really is kind of a warning, like, okay, this might work. Don't know. Risk is a little bit higher than we would like. Orange, probably want to try to bring more collateral. Red, kind of the no-fly zone. Like that's just not where you want to be. Green is really where you want to be, and we'll kind of get into some of that here in a moment. Okay, so first things first, take home monthly pay after taxes. Okay, so if you make 10 grand, if you make 120 grand a year, and after taxes you're bringing home, $7,000, great. Let's say you've got $5,000 in expenses, living costs, right? Be sure to include in this your food, your entertainment, your compulsive habits, anything, right? How much money do you spend on your life, on your bills, on your food, on everything else? Because we're also going to compare this to a standard DCA model where you don't convert your income to Bitcoin, and instead you just DCA with some portion of your remaining cash flow after you've paid bills. So for this particular scenario, I'm going to go ahead and say of the $2,000 I have in cash flow, right, take home pay minus your living costs, that's going to be $2,000 net monthly cash flow. What percentage of that are you spending on Bitcoin? I'm spending 25% of that. I'm doing a $500 a month DCA. Cool. Estimated income growth rate, let's just go ahead and say 5%. Expense growth rate, let's say 4%. Now back to the Bitcoin buffer, right? How many months worth of Bitcoin value are you bringing to this strategy? So let's say I have $60,000 in Bitcoin. How many months is that? Well, 60,000 divided by 5,000 is 12. So I have 12 months worth of buffer. And what am I going to pay to borrow this money? If you're doing DeFi, you might be in the 5 to 6 to 7% range. If you're doing CeFi, you might be in the 8 to 12 to 13% range. Let's just go ahead and say 10%. Okay? So our net monthly cash flow is $2,000. We're currently buying $500 worth of Bitcoin each month using a DCA strategy. That's going to be our cash flow model. But for our all-in model, we're going to see, well, what happens if I convert all of my money to Bitcoin? And let's just go ahead and say for the next 10 years, we think we're going to hit Saylor's bull case 37%. Okay. So first things first, the chart here is going to show us the all-in model, meaning we're converting $7,000 every single month into Bitcoin. Maybe it's $3,500 every paycheck, whatever, but $7,000 a month gets converted into Bitcoin. And we're borrowing $5,000 a month to pay our bills and cover our living expenses. Now, if you're using a CeFi lender, you probably have a 12-month loan term, so you may have taken out a much larger cash position up front to cover 6 months worth of expenses, right? And you might have a refinance strategy that works, every 6 months you're refinancing to take out the next 6 months. And in the meantime, you're depositing all of your Bitcoin into your collateral wallet with that lender, or into your cold storage or self-custody or whatever you're doing. But ultimately, with a CeFi lender, you're going to have likely a 12-month term, so you're probably going to be covering more than just 1 month worth of expenses. If you're doing DeFi, it's going to give you some flexibility, right? You're going to be able to borrow that $5K a month or even $2,500 every 2 weeks. And you're going to be able to do that ongoing, and the interest meter will just update accordingly. Okay? So regardless of how you're doing it, right, the LTV based on the ongoing amount of money that you're borrowing is going to, change in the same fashion. Okay? So as you're adding another $5,000 to your liability every single month, the LTV is going to go up pretty steeply in the beginning. Why is that? Well, because you are borrowing at a rate that's faster than the Bitcoin is appreciating. Now, even though it's appreciating at a flat 37% every year, well, when the growth is compounding, 37% next year compounds on top of the 37% I got this year. And 37% in 3 years compounds on top of the 37% I got in the second year, which also compounded on the 37% I got in the first year. So as that compounding scales and works over time, what ends up happening is by year 5, that 37% growth you're seeing is on a much more valuable underlying amount of Bitcoin, and you've also added to it, right? You're adding to this underlying collateral base every single 2 weeks, and you're only racking up, whatever that is, 5 divided by 7, like you're only borrowing 65% of the amount of Bitcoin that you're stacking each month, and you started with a 12-month buffer. So eventually this is going to flatten out because the compounding and your continued stacking, eventually the 37% appreciation on the underlying Bitcoin itself is actually going to be higher than the ongoing amount that you're borrowing against the collateral. And that's why this peaks out and it actually comes down pretty aggressively thereafter, because all of a sudden you're getting 37% on a larger collateral base, at least in terms of dollar value. Therefore, its appreciation each year is greater and greater and greater than the relatively static amount that you're borrowing against it. Okay. Now, let's come down here to the output table. Remember, we have 12 months worth of expenses as our buffer, right? $60,000 worth of Bitcoin. Our max LTV is going to be just under 40%. That's going to happen right at the 2-year mark. Now remember, we started both scenarios with the same amount of Bitcoin, right? $60,000. But in our cash flow only model, we are buying $500 every single month because we're doing 25% of our remaining cash flow after we pay bills, right? After we pay $5,000 to live using the $7,000 that we make, okay? And in this 10-year period, based on Bitcoin's growth and appreciation in price, we were able to acquire 0.19 net new Bitcoin, okay? Now, in the all-in model, we're converting all $7,000 every month into Bitcoin. That means we were able to acquire a little over 2.5 new Bitcoin in the same time period at the same job, right? Remember, these two scenarios are comparing the same income. It's just one converts all the income to Bitcoin and borrows dollars to live. The other pays bills, lives life, and then spends a quarter of that that's left over to buy Bitcoin. So the difference is pretty dramatic, right? You've got a little over 3 Bitcoin compared to 0.72 Bitcoin. One's worth $8 million, one's worth $1.8 million. Now, sure, you've got $1 million in debt you've accumulated here, and that's a lot, but $1 million off of $8 million leaves you with just about $7 million compared to only 1.8 here, and obviously that is a dramatic difference. If we annualize this total 10-year return, well, by doing this, you were able to realize a total of about $691,000 in value compared to $188,000 in value over here. Either one of those is great, but one is obviously quite a bit larger than the other. And at the end of the day, this is done using the exact same job, having the exact same schedule for work, doing the same things, making the exact same amount of money, getting the same amount of pay raises and increases and things of that nature. It's just the difference is one scenario you figured out how to implement your own sailor strategy and borrow dollars so that you could convert all of your own money and your own economic energy and your own personal balance sheet to Bitcoin. Okay. Now, like with a lot of our models, we have a little TLDR summary here, right? Kind of gives you a quick overview paragraph of what's going on. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to play with different values. Because, well, what happens if Bitcoin only does a Sailor bear case 21%? Right? Everything here is going to change, right? Now all of a sudden my max LTV has gone up to almost 50%. Granted, that's not happening until year 3, and maybe that's it gives me some sense of comfort. But either way, this is all going to change, right? What if you only have 3 months worth of cushion, right? What if you've only got $15,000 in Bitcoin to start this? Well, now you're maxing out at 60% LTV, and that's happening pretty quickly, right? Month 22. Oh, I was way off. Either way, so you can see these numbers are all going to change. I mean, okay, what if I make $7,000, but what if $6,000 of that is what I spend on my bills? Well, now you're borrowing almost all of what you make, and you're starting off with a pretty small buffer. What's the net result of that? Well, the net result of that is that you are in the danger zone, right? Like you're flying close to the sun at that point. Okay. Now, sure, if you think Bitcoin's going to go bananas, maybe you get out of trouble more quickly, but that's an estimate, right? You don't actually know what Bitcoin's going to do, neither do I, neither does anybody. So if you are to adopt this strategy and run this kind of risk up front, you do run some risks of getting liquidated because, well, you're pushing this LTV up extremely fast because your starting buffer is relatively low and you are borrowing almost all of what you make. And so that's going to have a dramatic impact on your LTV to start, even if you think that, Bitcoin is going to do 50% per year for the next 10 years. If you're wrong, and if we only hit 15%, well, you're putting yourself into liquidation territory in pretty short order, and that's not what you want to do. So, if you have questions or you need help, we're happy to engage. You can leave feedback here. Drop a comment. Let us know how to make this better. I hope this all makes sense. I know there's a lot going on here, but hopefully this explains some things. But yeah, if you like the model, great. Leave us a thumbs up. If you hate it, let us know why. Let us know how we can improve it. You can do that in the comment section below, or you can send us a note through here. Either way works for us. We appreciate your support, and we will see you on the next one.